Is Kyle Klondike. He's the managing editor of Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, University of Virginia Center for Politics. Thanks for joining us on the program. Appreciate it.
Hey, good morning.
So Rick Snyder is not going to be running for president. We had folks talking about that earlier in the broadcast. Now, from a statewide perspective, this is something that obviously we were covering. On the national stage, how big of an impact, how big of a blip on the radar did Rick Snyder make before he's decided to pull out?
I think he was always on the periphery of the presidential discussion, particularly because there are just so many Republican candidates who are running. And so if he were to have gotten in, I think, he would have gotten a little bit of attention nationally, but I don't think anybody would have looked at him as a, top-tier contender. And I'm sure that Snyder's folks, were paying attention to this and were, kind of sniffing around as to whether his candidacy was viable or not. And I think they probably found that it really wasn't viable given all the competition and the fact that, unlike so many of these other candidates, Snyder's not someone who really is all that well known nationally.
And what would have it taken for Rick Snyder to have a viable candidacy for president on a national scale, do you think? Because he's got a good story to tell, and he could appeal to moderates, and, on paper it doesn't look like it's all that unrealistic.
I think it would have taken a lot of the other candidates basically falling apart, because I just think that, I don't know why voters would vote for Snyder over someone like Scott Walker or even John Kasich of Ohio, who looks like he's about to enter. And those are just two other governors. You've got, Senator Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush. And I feel like, if anything, Snyder's votes would have come from Bush's column. And so maybe the effect of Snyder running is that, and maybe of like John Kasich running too in Ohio, would be that maybe they would make it less likely for Bush to win, because if you're the kind of establishment candidate and you have other kind of establishment-oriented candidates, kind of like Snyder and Kasich running, those votes would come from Bush, and then that might open the door to a different, more conservative Republican nominee. So it's just as interesting. Again, the field is so big, like we're probably going to have at least 10 major candidates and probably more, that, the machinations in terms of who gets in or not, even for folks who probably didn't have much chance of winning the nomination, like Snyder, they matter. They would have mattered in the sense that, they affect, the votes they get have to come from someone else.
We're talking with Kyle Klondike. He's the managing editor of Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, the University of Virginia's Center for Politics. I'm taking a look at a post that you guys put up yesterday where you're taking a look at the field for president. You had Rick Snyder in that third tier of governor alternatives. I'm taking a look at the first tier. I'm a little surprised because I only see three names in the first tier: Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, and Scott Walker. And then in the second tier, you've got Ted Cruz and Rand Paul. And then Chris Christie kicked down to the third tier. Talk about this. Why is that first tier so limited to these three?
Well, for all the people in the field, there aren't a ton of people that you can actually, credibly think of at this point being able to win the nomination. I mean, I think that, the Bush, Rubio, and Walker seem to be the folks who have the best ability to unite various wings of the party. Bush is very much in the mold, I think, of the last two Republican nominees, John McCain and Mitt Romney, in terms of being, I think, having a lot of resources and also having the support of basically the middle of the party and also the leadership of the party. And typically, the person who wins these nominations has the support of the party leadership. But maybe it's different this time. But there are tons of names on the list. But again, it's hard to imagine a lot of these guys actually being able to win the nomination, and that's why the first tier is as small as it is.
And then we were taking a look at the fourth tier. We're getting down to Mike Huckabee, who just announced this week, Ben Carson, who announced this week, Rick Santorum, who's kicking around and is definitely going to get in at some point, and We've also got Carly Forini, who's talking about it.
Fiorina. Yeah.
Golly, see, I don't even know how to pronounce the name for crying out
Well,
loud.
and probably most Americans wouldn't know how to either. That's part of the thing. Is some of these candidates have very niche appeal.
No, but in the last presidential election, it seemed like the Republicans were just cycling through kind of a flavor of the month. You saw Rick Perry get hot for a little bit. Rick Santorum got hot. It seemed like everybody was kind of taking turns, and then they would flame out for one reason or the other. Is there a potential for that again this time around?
Sure, I think so. I think the difference, though, is that the last time you had, really the only credible candidates in that field at the end of the day were Romney and then Rick Perry right when he got in. And I think what happened was that you had, after Perry flamed out, you had a lot of potential alternatives to Romney sort of pop up and then fall back. But ultimately, it seemed fairly clear for most of the process that Romney was going to get the nomination. This time, you've got a lot more sitting office holders. Most of the big figures in the Republican Party are running in this election, and that was not true in 2012. And that's what makes it a deeper field and a field that I think is harder to predict.
Is there any chance Hillary Clinton is not the Democratic nominee?
I think I think there's a chance, but I think it's like less than a 10% chance, and it would involve, probably her dropping out of the race for some reason, or some other candidate, entering the field late and catching fire in a way that's basically hard to imagine at this point. But no, she's in great shape to win the nomination.
And then last thing, we got about a minute left. I wanted to talk about your Electoral College ratings. You've got Michigan as a likely Democratic state going into the 2016 presidential election. Why is that?
Michigan is almost always more Democratic than the nation as a whole. I think if the Republican were to win it, that person would be racking up a lot of electoral votes, certainly a lot more than the 270 he or she would need. I feel like Michigan is this kind of fool's gold state for Republicans. We even saw it in the Senate race last year, where it may look initially competitive and the Republicans are enticed to put money into it, but ultimately the state typically leans Democratic in these federal elections.
Kyle Klondike, he's the managing editor of Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, University of Virginia Center for Politics. Thanks for joining us on the program today.